Hey, happy February, everyone. Few quick announcements. Strength classes are running again. If you're not in the GroupMe app yet, let me know. I started a partnership with Integrated Massage. I'll have an email go out as well. But for those that are interested, your first massage with them, you get 20 bucks off. They're in Edina and Minnetonka. Like I said, there'll be an email going out with that as well. And then reminder that next month, Malia, who was on the call last month briefly, is leading the call. She's a physical therapist. We're going to talk all things related to physical therapy and running. Okay, so I'm sure some of you already know this if you're in the GroupMe, but tonight we're talking about heart rate. And before we talk about heart rate, I'm going to give a couple examples of how we're going to kind of think about heart rate / why we're talking about it. So this was first inspired. This weekend, I had a client text me this exact message right here. It basically says that she was doing her long run of about a half marathon distance. She's doing Big Sur in March, and she is up to 13 miles. And she texted me, and she was worried about how much her heart rate was spiking during the run. And she threw some other details in here, as you can see if you're reading the message from. Specifically, she was worried about the hills and how she had to end up going to a little bit of a run walk towards the end of her last 2-3 miles. And then some other further details on her, just so you are aware, is she's great with fuel. So that wasn't like one of the issues, at least from what I've been told. She's roughly 40 to 45, and they are running roughly 30+ mile weeks. You don't get to figure out, or you don't get to know how I would solve this yet or answer this. That's part of the fun. Okay, that's example number one that I wanted to share. Example number two, and I got permission from this lovely individual tonight, is kind of a different way to think about it. This person gave some examples here, and she sent this text of, hey, during hiking, during, those lower intensity activities, my heart rate's typically in zone 1. But whenever I do a run, it ends up spiking and I'm in zone 5 the whole time. Like, what's going on with that? Should I be worried? Should I be concerned, etc.? Because max heart rate, zone 5, I mean, you're in your max heart rate. And if you're holding that for a long time, it could be concerning, right? So this is example 2. My goal of tonight is to give enough information in the next 25-ish minutes for everyone in here to be able to have an educated guess on how I would answer those 2 examples / go over them. That's my goal. We'll see if I can hit it, okay? But before we do that, it is important we first have a good understanding of why our heart rate goes up in the first place. Does anyone polling the audience feel brave enough to answer this question? I asked Kaylee it last night on the pod. Fun fact. I'm going to give it like 10 seconds and see if anyone wants to try to answer it. Don't overthink it.
Reoxygenate the blood? Your guess.
It's a pretty good answer. It's a pretty good answer. I'm going to say less complex than that, but I like that. You're not wrong. Anyone else want to take a guess?
To regulate the body or something?
Yeah, similar to Todd. You're not wrong either. The very on a simplistic level, I'm going to take everyone down a notch. Our heart rate rises for threats, stress, right? Think about back in like middle school or elementary school when we used to give presentations and how scared we got and your heart rate's like, dumping out of your chest, right? Or the example of you're running from a lion in olden times, right? Your heart rate is rising to tell you that you're in a high stress situation. Why that could be going up could be a, variety of different things. In today's society, it could be work. It could be maybe you have to take your dog out and you're stressed about fitting it into the schedule. It could be running, adding running into our lives. And because you're running and moving and your muscles need more blood to them, your heart rate's rising to accommodate for that. Stress is the main reason our heart rate goes up. All right. That's one thing I want to make sure everyone knows before we dive too deep into like the weeds on heart rate and specifically zones and whatnot. Okay. The second thing that I want everyone to know, and I'm going to pull the audience again because I love doing this. Does anyone in here know what I mean when I say the term heart rate drift? And bonus points if you know why it happens. Your hint is that it's very common in the ultra running world, more specifically than road running. You know?
We just talked about it yesterday. Effort.
You're on the path.
So like if I'm running downhill, it's easier, but then uphill, it takes more effort. So then the heart rate would rise.
I like it. That's a good answer. I like it. You're on the right path. It's a hard question. I don't think, honestly, if I asked, 10 coaches, I don't know that 9 would tell me what I want to hear, to be honest. Amy, are you raising your hand because you want to guess?
I think it's when you're running longer. So like the ultra runners, your heart rate just, the longer you run, the higher it goes.
Exactly. Do you happen to know why that happens? Bonus points. Anyone know why it happens?
Is it because your heart's working that much harder? It's been working that long and that hard. And the only reason I know this is I listened to a podcast on Friday.
Ooh, what podcast?
It was by Perry. What's his first name?
Perry.
Perry. Perry is the last name. What's his first name? Why am I drawing a blank? But anyway, he's I think from South Africa and England, and he does a lot with 50 plus runners. Mm-hmm. So I was bored at work, so I listened to his podcast.
You should send me it.
Oh, okay.
Or you can drop it in the chat too, actually, if anyone else wants to listen. But I'm curious.
Yeah, no. So he was talking about that, and then I have another idea for one of our meetings that he was talking about too. So, but I can tell you that later.
Yes.
So anyway,
I love it. I love how so many people answered too. Okay, so yeah, Amy hit it pretty much perfectly on the head. It's essentially, even if you take running out of the equation, if you just say exercising, over time, if you exercise at a steady heart rate, whatever it is, 120, and you exert the exact amount of effort, exact amount of force, etc., over time, your heart rate's going to go up, right? So in the case of a hiker, incline, if you're on an incline treadmill for 15 degrees and you're at whatever speed and the speed doesn't change, the heart rate's going to rise over time. Something important to note is that is different for every single individual. And there are a lot of factors that go into that, from age to stress in your life to your fitness level, et cetera, okay? What causes it specifically? More stress on the body, essentially, over time. Your body's either going to get dehydrated, it's going to get more fatigued, you're going to need more blood. And more blood means you have to pump out more blood, okay? Now that you all know so much about heart rates, I'm going to sit here and read off these charts for the next 20 minutes. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. That was a joke. No one's laughing. Okay. I'm going to point out the important things that we need to know from those charts. So these charts right here, you can see on the left is the kind of the meat and potatoes of what we're going to talk about is heart rate zones. I'm going to show you a little bit more simplified version to think about. But on the right, before we even go into our heart rate zones and why that's become a thing in the endurance realm, we need to think about our energy systems. So if you think back to probably high school biology, is my guess is where you first heard about it, maybe chemistry, I don't know. We have 3 energy systems that we use. The first one is our ATP PC. This is why I've been big on creatine specifically. Creatine helps this system. It's roughly 1 to 10 seconds. That says 1 to 5, but it's like the peak force. Think about this as like you're sprinting, your max bench pressing, etc. Okay. Your next system, lactic acid glycolysis system, that's your system that takes over after that, 5 to 60 seconds. And then finally, anything greater than that 60 seconds is your aerobic system. The reason that this is important is because when we kind of equate this to your heart rate systems, those zones, your heart rate zones, specifically the anaerobic versus aerobic zones, match up with this. All right. So your aerobic is this aerobic system. And we'll get into that a little bit more depth in a second. Your anaerobic include these other two. And more specifically, when you are running, when you are exercising, think about doing a marathon. It's not as though you are just using one of these systems the entire time. Like you're not just going to be in an aerobic system and never touch these other systems. Good example, if you're running and you run up a steep hill, your heart rate's going to spike. Okay, you're going to go into a different heart rate zone, but you're going to use a different energy system. You're going to start burning different levels of carbs versus fat, maybe using creatine differently, et cetera. Okay. It's important to understand and know that essentially before we kind of dive into more specifics around heart rate zones and the aerobic side of things. So I wanted to give you a little brief high level on that. Okay. Okay. So now we're going to talk about heart rate zones, the meat and potatoes of tonight. Okay. So with heart rate zones, I put together this fun little Oak Endurance graphic that I'm going to also use for Instagram. And there are 5 different zones. I want us to first start at the top here. And I'm going to break these down. These first zones 1 through 3, those are the energy systems I just talked about. This is your aerobic energy system zone. Okay. This means with oxygen. Zones 4 and 5, that is that more anaerobic system. All right. So thinking back to those original case studies of, oh, should I be worried if I'm in zone 4 or 5, if I'm maxing out my heart rate, et cetera, right? Should I be spending more time in zones 1, 2, 3? We're about to find out, okay? So zone 1, think about, I'm going to define all these first. Zone 1, think about this as roughly 50 to 60% of your max heart rate. Typically, I would say this is like your warm up, your cool down. It's your maybe walking with a friend outside potentially, and everything below that, okay? This is recovery. We're adding a little stress on the body. It's how do you know you're in that zone? You can hold it all day, all right? Zone 2, this is where we start getting into more of that quote unquote, like true aerobic zone. This is like when we're running and training, right? This is 60 to 70% of our max heart rate. This is your easy miles. This is your marathon pace threshold line, depending again on some fitness level and whatnot. The reason that we are using this zone specifically is because we want to increase our overall aerobic capacity. By increasing your overall aerobic capacity, you are becoming more aerobically fit, which means you can handle more aerobic fitness. That is the point of zone 2. That's when I'm talking about, you know, the car analogy and building the engine size. That's what zone 2 is for. All right. This is your singing. It's your conversational pace. It's probably something you can hold for well over an hour. Zone 3, there's a little asterisk above it. The reason for it is because this is the zone where things start getting a little gray, your gray zone. And by gray, you might have heard that term before. It's kind of like it's where things start blurring a little bit, right? Between aerobic into anaerobic. You may start now feeling your heart rate's supposedly getting up to 70 to 80% of the max heart rate, right? Your workouts now in this zone, they're no longer easy. They're going to be more like moderate. You can think about it if you're, you know, using terms like lactic threshold and things like that. This is the start of your lactic threshold and that building up in the body. When we are using it, I like to think about this zone as we are working to increase our ability to hold, quote unquote, a faster pace for a longer amount of time. We're working on increasing our ability to hold a faster pace for a longer amount of time. Think speed endurance or being uncomfortably comfortable. You can likely get out 1 to 2 sentences, and it's probably something you can hold for 20 to 60 minutes. Again, or not again, but this is where we're starting to blur those lines. And why that's important to understand is because, well, Jacob, 20 to 60 minutes, like those are completely different paces, right? If you go back to the workout here, right, moderate run versus lactate threshold, those are two completely different things, right? So depending on fitness level, this zone, 70 to 80, all of these kind of make this, this rule applies to, but this zone, you could be hitting different things in. So keep that in mind too, as we're moving forward, okay? Zone 4, 80 to 90%. This is you have now surpassed the level in which you can clear out any lactic acid. So like that burning sensation in your legs is starting to happen because your body can't get rid of lactic acid fast enough. You are approaching your critical velocity. We're going to think about that as the start of your VO2 max, which means you're approaching the amount of maximum oxygen you can take in and use. So think about this as now you're starting to huff and puff a little bit. You might be able to get 3 to 6 words out, but you're not singing, you're not having a full-on conversation. You shouldn't even be able to muster like 1 to 2 sentences, right? The final zone, zone 5, is 90 plus. And then it gets into the black over here, which is your max heart rate. And I didn't talk about these, but the formulas are down here if you want to, do the actual max for yourself. But 90 plus over here, that's zone 5. Now you're past your VO2 max. This is like sprinting, it's speed, it's development. You are focusing on your breathing. You're not really focusing on whether or not you can talk, right? This isn't just running either, right? Again, why I showed those energy systems is because those anaerobic energy systems, zone 4 into 5, Kaylee has been talking about how when she's lifting, she'll be doing like 5 reps on a squat. And she's like, holy smokes, Jacob, my heart rate's getting to orange and red, right? She's in zone 4 or 5. So you can equate this to, things outside running as well, but we're using it more specifically for running. Okay. So now the question, kind of thinking back to those case studies a little bit here, the question bears, why are these zones important? Why do I need to train them? How should I train them? Is it, a worry if I'm in zone 5, etc.? And I'm going to have everyone think about this first, thinking, we know the energy systems, we know the zones, okay? Before you even think about all these different zones and whatnot, we have 2 types of difficulties when we first start exercise. You have easy and you have hard. And I'm gonna speak specifically about running, right? Think about the first time you ever went for a run. It was just hard, right? You weren't thinking about, am I burning glucose? Am I burning fat? Am I working my lactate threshold, right? Your heart rate was probably, if you're wearing a watch, it was probably maxed out. Probably. It was probably very hard. Okay. So I like to think about that as building fitness, base training, periods like that. We have easy and we have hard. Getting comfortable with those 2 feelings first is step 1. Once that becomes an equivalent to running here again, remember, once that becomes comfortable and you're like, okay, I have easy and I have hard, but now I'm starting to play around and, I've been running maybe 10, 15, 20 miles a week for a while, whatever. And now I'm noticing that, I have kind of a moderate pace, right? And maybe like you're doing runs where you start pretty chill, you speed up to that like moderate pace, and then you finish on hard. Maybe now 4 miles doesn't seem as hard anymore, or 2 miles doesn't seem as hard anymore. You can start thinking about going longer, right? At this point is when I will start to think about zones a little bit more in depth. All right. And that is where it comes into play a little bit with like clients and like, what is your goal, right? If you have a client that comes to me and they simply are like, hey, Jacob, I want to be able to just run and not have it hurt. I don't want to ever be in that hard zone. right? If you look at this chart, based on those goals, if they were just running by themselves, right? Zone 2 is probably where I would tell them to spend most of their time then, right? If they're just simply trying to improve the amount of time they can spend on their feet and run. Now, if you have someone that comes to me and says, hey, Jacob, I want to improve my finish time, like my kick at the end of a race. I'm starting to get more into 5Ks, 10Ks, whatever. I want to be able to finish harder. Okay. We might start touching on that zone 5. And that's where structured workouts come into play of things as low, like maybe strides at the end of a run or hill sprints, different things like that, where you're touching on that zone 5 and working on it specifically, right? And this continues with 5K, 10K, half, marathon. General fitness, you might work on all of them, okay? All of the zones flow into each other and help each other. This graph is also kind of cool. I don't have a lot to say about it, to be honest. I just thought it was cool, and a client of mine shared it with me, so I wanted to share it with all of you to think about it from another perspective too. So you can see there's multiple different ways of thinking about it, but again, it's this aerobic in zone 1 to zone 2. The colors change, then you kind of get into anaerobic, and then anaerobic is max heart rate at the end of this zone 3. This person's using a 3-zone model, right? Then you have like, basic RPEs. You have the 5-zone model I talked about. Your heart rate's down here. Again, I more so just wanted to share this in case anyone wanted it or wanted to look further at it. And then I also wanted to point out too that like there are so many different ways to measure these things. So you have the zone 3 up there, but then we talked about zone 5 zones tonight. Like which one's right? And that goes back to like, what are you trying to accomplish? Because you could also go easy, marathon tempo, intervals, reps. You can think about RPE, right? There's a lot of different things you can think about. So that's kind of why I wanted to bring that up. And then before we dive into the case studies a little bit more, the other thing I wanted to also talk about, and I think this is very important, are heart rate gadget tools. Why are my notes gone? Okay, whatever. I'll just do this off the dome. Heart rate gadget tools. Okay. So here's the thing with gadgets. When we have something on our wrist that is telling us our heart rate, we tend to become attached to that and what it is telling us. And what I mean by that is if you see your heart rate on your watch go up to like max, you're going to automatically think you are working harder than you likely are. You may be at max, like, right? But generally speaking, think about in a race when you're running and you look at your watch and you're like, oh shit, it's higher than I thought it was supposed to be. And all of a sudden now you feel like you're working harder, right? It influences the way we feel. These gadgets influence the way we feel. So that's something very important to remember. And then, furthermore from that, you end up in situations sometimes where I think it was the second example. The first example with the 13 miler, the client did the last weekend. When you're running and you're getting like miles 10, 11, where it should be pretty hard in the long run, right? And you see that your heart rate's at 170, quote unquote, zone 5 maxed out. And it tells you to be like, oh shoot, I need to slow down. When do you actually need to slow down, right? There's other things you can be thinking about. Again, like if you're getting told by your watch you're in zone 5, but you're able to hold a conversation with your friend next to you, you're not in zone 5. Your watch just may think you are. So it telling you that and you being like, oh shit, I'm in zone 5. I need to slow down. Now you start playing these mind games. You get into the mental side of the sport of like, am I working harder? Am I like than I thought I was? Oh, maybe I do need to slow down. Oh, now my body actually does hurt, right? So things like that to really keep in mind and consider, okay? And the role it plays on our mental game. The other thing with these heart rate gadgets, they're not that accurate. And they're definitely not accurate if you can stick a finger under your watch. See this? No problem getting my finger under here. And this is, pretty tight. They're very not accurate. They also lag behind. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think I said on the pod yesterday, like by 3 minutes or something. So a lot of times when you're looking at your watch, it's actually like lagging behind and trying to catch up. So if you've ever done like a speed workout, you might notice how during your rest recovery, it's like still super spiked. Okay. They are tools. They're not like the end all be all. So please remember that as well. Okay. So back to the original examples that I brought up. Okay. This first one and how I would go about this. And hopefully you have some ideas in your head. But with this person specifically, one thing that right off the bat I'm noticing is that it's her longest run she's ran in years. Okay. It's going to feel really freaking hard, especially the last, like, this I think took her just over 2 hours, right? Imagine doing something for 2 hours. It's going to get hard, right? Your heart rate will definitely go up. Okay. I didn't share this, but we looked at some of her other data and we noticed that for a lot of her runs, so her age is 40 to 45. And if you use the max heart rate formula that I put down here, again, I didn't really go over it super in depth because I was hoping you guys kind of knew, but maybe should have. But 220 minus 40, 45, it's like 180 roughly. We noticed that a lot of her runs, she's been running at 150 to 160, like across the board. And then she'll do speed workouts where she's at like 160 to 165. So she's not even ever in, again, back to these zones, she's not even ever in like sub zone 3, ever. So we talked about the importance of, okay, when we're running those easy miles, effort-wise and whatnot, let's be conscious now and let's make sure that they're in that zone 2. Because what's likely happening for her, someone that's running 30 miles a week, every single run's probably very hard right now, which, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, like, you end up playing this game where you're not fully recovering potentially. You're not able to potentially finish a long run because your body by the end of the week is just kind of burnt out. Your speed workouts, you may not be hitting like the top ranges that you want to, etc. All right. So for someone like this, that's the route I take first. And then there's further evaluation and whatnot. But that is how I would go about this first example, specifically based off of everything we just talked about. Also with the run walk on this, that is perfectly fine as well. And run walking will help you manage heart rate systems as well. So keep that in mind too. If your heart rate's, on runs and whatnot, maxing out, okay? If you're trying to hit zone 2, you might need to do a little run walk, okay? And then example 2 here, and how I go about this example specifically. So just moving my screen so I can see things a little better. Okay, so with this specific one, you have a situation in which basically whenever this individual runs, it just gets really hard and their heart rate maxes out to 150 or 160 on their watch, which is alarming, right? Like, again, I don't really want athletes running at 150 to 160. But so taking a step back, the first thing I would assure this person is that realistically, you're not actually at your maximum heart rate, whatever that number is. Everyone's different. Those formulas only work for, formulas. They're not 100%. If you are actually running at your max heart rate for, an hour or whatever, you would probably have a heart attack, which would be very sad. So, I would reassure them with that first. Then the next thing I would talk about is the heart rate device data that we went over. I'd make sure that they're wearing their heart rate device very tightly. I would also talk about how, in my experience, and the last person that had an Apple Watch too, and I didn't bring this up, but Apple Watches, in my experience, are less accurate as heart rate measurers, even so, compared to like a Garmin or a Coros that was designed for this world. But a heart rate strap might be a good idea or something to think about, or the old-fashioned way of counting beats per second, right? Something to think about with that. And then the last thing I would talk about or start asking questions to, this is a strength client, not a run coaching client. I would start thinking about what does the program look like? And what are your goals? if you are running and every single run right now, you're going up to max heart rate, I would ask, okay, what about like for a 2-mile run? Like what does that feel like? Because 4 miles is fucking long. Like it's super long. And a 10-mile run, like this one, I'm trying to see the maximum duration on it. I think it's 2 hours, but again, that's a long time. Like your heart rate is going to be shot. So it started asking a little bit more about like the programming. Like again, does your heart rate go up for a mile? Like when you run just the mile, does it automatically max up like that? And if so, maybe we could work on kind of that easy hard and getting comfortable running at certain distances more specifically and just feeling confident with every single run you do. And then I would also look at like lifetime, the life factors a little bit too with this individual. And, you know, when you start your run, like what's your average heart rate throughout the day? Is it like, do you have a higher average heart rate for your age? Things like that. What does your stress load look like? You know, different things like that. So both those are a little open-ended, but those are roughly how I would go about answering those. And as you see, there's a lot of it depends with that. So that was a lot. I realized I just kind of blabbed for a very long time. We have a podcast on this too. I'm sure I missed something that I should have maybe said, but hopefully you gained something from this. Hopefully you have a little bit better of an understanding. And now is the time for questions on this topic.
The podcast comes out this Wednesday, by the way, on this topic. It's not out yet. I have a question.
Yes.
For measuring your heart rate for like the max heart rate thing, would runners in general have, like, is this calculation for just the average person? And if you're a runner, like, have they done research on, can it be higher or should it be lower?
You're talking about the 220?
Yeah.
That's like from NASM, National Academy of Sports Medicine. Well, actually, it's all, if you just Google how to calculate your max heart rate, that's where I got that from though. But that's not specific to endurance. It's not specific to endurance. That's just how do you calculate your max heart rate. The Phil Maffetone method, I would argue even also like, you know, it's more specific to like aerobic versus anaerobic. And your second question is so this is an interesting topic because in my mind, if you have two people, say that are both 30 years old and one is a chain smoker and eats very bad and sleeps like an hour a night and does that consistently until they're 40, and the other one is 30 and for the next 10 years is by all standards very healthy, I have a hard time believing that they have the exact same max heart rate. Now, according to like research and science and data, if you go look, it will argue that they do. And the benefit is that your average resting heart rate, which gets into a little bit different of a topic, is actually where you benefit. So like that smoker person probably has a higher resting heart rate. And when you have a higher resting heart rate, your body just has to work harder, right? Like we talked about, to keep you alive than the other person. So it gets into a little bit of a interesting topic, I guess, because I don't know how much I fully agree with that, but there's more research that's needed on it. To answer your question.
Thanks.
Jacob, I have a question.
Hit me.
So going back to that example too, maybe this is too simplistic, but it just seems like another solution, correct me if I'm wrong, would just be that to run slower, just slow down the pace a little bit, since it's spiking so quickly up that heart rate. Would that help solve it too, that maybe just running too fast?
100%. Yeah. Remember I said I can miss things? 100%. Yeah. And that gets into, again, I didn't even really talk about this. Like, we are all so much different. Think about it this way. Walking. For the people in this room, walking is very easy. We are all very, blessed and you should be grateful for that. It's very easy for us to move from point A to point B, right? For some other people, that's zone 5. Okay. More specific to this room, we have ultra runners, we have 200 runners, we have sub 3 hour marathoners, we have people that are more focused on high rock. Like there's a bunch of different people in this room going on, right? So we do not all have the same zone 5, zone 4, zone 3, zone 2 by like pace. And we also don't have the same margins. Depending on what you train, I have a client who is very focused on the mile right now, and his top end speed is so much better than like any of his other zones, right? He goes from easy top end speed, easy top end speeds here. This what is supposed to be here is about this big. Like there is no zones between because he's so specifically trained in that zone 5. So you can also train the specific zones, right? So Tim, to go back to your original question of just understanding like that pace, I think they were running at like I don't know, 9:30 or whatever. If that is according to the watch zone 5, which again, just careful how you trust that. You can probably say maybe zone 4, I would say, right? If you slow down, how much do you need to slow down to hit that zone 2? And then keep in mind too, there becomes more in the weeds here. There becomes a different question you need to ask yourself then. If you get to a point where you're running 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 even, like minute miles, like pace wise, and you are running the whole time to keep your heart rate at zone 2, another thing you can think about doing is, would it be more efficient if I walked? Because running and then running at a faster pace and then walking at a slower pace to keep your heart rate in that zone 2. This is like trail running in a nutshell, right? To keep your heart rate in a zone 2 is going to actually be less fatigue on your body than if you try to keep your heart rate in zone 2 or 3 or whatever and are running at a too slow of a pace for what your body can handle. We all have that threshold line. Again, that line is different too. For some, it could be 11. For some, it could be 14. For some, it could be 17, right? You hit a threshold line where, now my IT bands are starting to hurt a little bit. My feet feel weird every time you feel the extra force for moving like a little bit slower and or too slow. And then what can happen is the run walking will actually give your body the proper mechanics and form, etc., to run and feel more effective, right? So that's something also to think about too. Very long answer to your question. Any other questions?
Yeah, Jacob, this isn't a question, it's more of a statement, and maybe it's something you've talked about in a previous call that I wasn't a part of, but I just looking at the bit that you've got above the zone 1 and 2 there where it says fat as a fuel source versus carb and glucose as a fuel source. I'm just interested in I guess how you would think about fueling based on the balance that you have among the different heart rate zones in like a training plan or something like that. Like I said, more of a statement, not necessarily a question.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, you're kind of asking like, should I become fat adaptive versus carb adaptive while I'm running?
Well, yeah, I guess just I never think of my training like that. I don't think about it in terms of zones necessarily that much. And that's just me personally. But at the same time, I do think a lot about fueling. Right. And so I just wonder how you would start to incorporate that a little bit more, or that kind of mentality of like how fueling relates to your heart rate zones and where you're at when you're training.
Mm-hmm. You fully understand.
Is in like, what are you intaking? So like if we're doing, zone 1, 2, should I be having more of like fats, proteins versus if I'm doing more of like sprint track workouts and high intensity, should we be doing more of like carbs and glucose?
Yeah. And I guess like I said, more just like a curiosity that I have, like of
Yeah.
how putting together a fueling plan feeds into like this way of thinking about training with heart rate zones. So
Yeah.
yeah, like I said, more just like a curiosity than anything, not so much a question.
Yeah, like where my mind goes with that is starting to think about now, like, okay, what are the average percentages we should have of each macro for being like an endurance athlete in our daily life? And then some more specifics, like the actual run that we're doing, what specific type of maybe like gels and whatnot we should take during those runs. That's kind of where my mind is going with what you said. It'd be fun to, I'll have to pick your brain a little bit more on that and see if I can fully understand, and then give a little talk on that, because that's a whole nother thing that we didn't even really go into. And the reasoning for that is I felt like it gets very complex fast, quite frankly. So
But I feel like with like carbs and glucose, those are like your fast forms of fuel, right? So if I'm thinking of, I'm going to, a Mill City track workout, I'm eating more of like a piece of toast or some oatmeal, maybe some peanut butter on it. Versus if I'm doing like a more low intensity, easy miles, I'm doing a strength workout, I'm thinking more of like eggs, more protein, more fats, because those are more of like the slower burning fuel sources. Also in like an ultra, I'm trying to take in more of like fats and proteins than I would be or doing like a mile, because I'm pulling from stores for a longer period of time, versus like getting the fast twitch muscles, faster workouts, which are very like carbs are a lot faster absorbed or used.
yeah, this is where like, remember in the very beginning where I talked a little bit how you can mix and match zones? This is where that comes into play a little bit too, because your body, very briefly, your body can roughly hold 2,000 calories worth of carbs. And when you exercise, when we are working in aerobic zones or anaerobic zones, the reason that you use carbs is because you need energy like fucking that, right? Think about, again, that ATP versus glycolysis, like it's immediate, right? And that's carb, glucose is very quick burning, right? Fats take longer to digest, but you can store more fat. So then the aerobic world, we get into these mindsets of like, oh, if I can train my body to become very aerobic and use only fat, then I won't need, to focus on much of the carbs, right? And that's where it like gets into like the ultra world a little bit, and like why like ultra runners can maybe stomach different things than like a road runner running their, 170 heart rate, right? And they have to use just glucose because they couldn't even stomach it, right? So I'm not going to go super far into all that because it's 7:45 and that could be a whole presentation itself. But it's a very good point and topic, and I think it's something that I should tackle it in the future as well. That'd be fun.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Very good question.
Thanks for humoring me.
Yeah.
It's a good thing to think about.
And all this shit, like, dude, all this gets so into you can get into the weeds with this stuff so quick too. Something also to keep in mind, like, our body's wild. So any other questions about anything that anyone wants to make sure I answer or hit on? Next call is March 3rd, exactly 1 month from now. Currently the first Monday of January, February, and March. We're all the 3rd, so that's fun. If you need anything, you know where to find us. And the quote for this month is, "Stay committed, your life is changing."